The most common misconception is kind of the Hollywood misconception, right? It's that kids are kidnapped, that they're held against their will, that there's physical force. And what we find is that, that is a very small percentage of the kids that we work with. The large majority of kids that we work with are groomed, they're recruited. It's a longer process. Some are trafficked by family members. Some are trafficked for drugs, for rent, for support, financial support, because the family doesn't have significant financial resources. Some are recruited because and trafficked because they're involved in child welfare or juvenile justice, and they're looking for maybe families that they don't have and love and attention and support. And but we've also seen kids trafficked who come from well-resourced homes with two parents, and it would surprise you. The reality is traffickers are going to try to find a vulnerability, right? Whatever your child's vulnerability is, and then they're going to exploit that.
Hey friends, Happy New Year and welcome to Public Health Careers. I'm Omari Richins, founder of the Public Health Millennial. Every other week, I interview leaders and practitioners across public health, sharing their expertise, lived experiences, and the strategies that can move you and your career forward. January is National Human Trafficking Awareness Month, and while awareness is important, it's not enough. What we really need is a clearer understanding of how trafficking actually happens, who is vulnerable, and what effective prevention and survivor supports truly look like. Too often, trafficking is shaped by Hollywood myths, when in reality, it's deeply connected to emotional vulnerability, unstable or unsafe home environments, economic stress, and the growing role of technology in young people's lives. Today's conversation helps us move past misconceptions and towards evidence-based prevention-focused action. I'm joined by Erin Williamson, a licensed clinical social worker and the Chief Programs and Strategy Officer at Love 146. Erin has spent more than 2 decades working in child welfare and anti-trafficking, from national hotline leadership to building trauma-informed prevention and survivor care programs that now reach youth in over 30 states. In this episode, we talk about the real dynamics of trafficking, why education and healthy relationship skills need to start early, how victimization affects all genders, and the critical role that public health and community engagement play in protecting young people, and much, much more. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and enjoy today's episode.
Perfect. Hi, my name is Erin Williamson. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and welcome to Public Health Careers.
Hey, Erin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Super excited to have you.
Wonderful.
So jumping into a little bit of your personal identity, how do you identify, and tell us a little about your personal background?
Absolutely. So I am white, cisgender female, and I have lived kind of all across the United States, born in California, made my way to Minnesota, and then over to the East Coast. I've also lived abroad in Kenya and Mexico and have done some work there with street children and child sexual exploitation. And I am currently based in Connecticut.
What do you do for fun?
Oh gosh, what do I do for fun? Well, I have 2 kids, so they keep me very busy. They're also, one's a preteen, one's a teen, so I understand not only this issue in terms of prevention in general, but kind of public health for adolescents in terms of my own experience. But we go on hikes. We love. My son's a swimmer. My daughter's a dancer. And so we're doing a lot of shuffling now to different practices and meets and competitions.
Well, I love that. I love that. And thank you for the very holistic background that you gave me and very intriguing story. Looking forward to diving more into it. And as someone who used to swim and my sister used to dance, to the parents, love that. Continue to support it as much as you can. But that's awesome.
Yeah, they're wonderful sports, and they kind of move the whole body, which is really great.
Yeah, we love when we can move our bodies. Erin, you are Chief Programs and Strategy Officer at Love 146. What do you do?
Yeah, the name does not give us away. So we are an anti-trafficking organization. We work across the United States. We also have kind of a sister program in the Philippines that we support. and work with. And we provide prevention education in schools and after school programs, in detention facilities, anywhere where we can kind of connect with the kids. And we also provide survivor care services to youth who have experienced child trafficking.
That's amazing work that y'all are doing. I love 146. And what do you do in your role as a chief program and strategy officer?
Yeah, well, I'm going to go back a little. So
Mhm.
when I started at Love 146, I was actually hired to build what is now our survivor care program, and it was one of those job descriptions where you read it online and you think this is an impossible job, right? It was a single person meant to build a statewide program across the state of Connecticut, as well as provide direct services to youth, again across the state of Connecticut, and really, this was a program that we were building the plane as we flew it. I started the program, I should even say my job on January 4th. And by January 18th, we had our first referral. And so now the program has grown. We have over 20 staff members. Most of them are licensed social workers. And they're working with kids throughout the state of Connecticut. We've served over 1,000 children. And we also work with these children not just to address the immediate trauma of trafficking, but also to help them successfully transition into adulthood. And so now what I get the privilege of doing is overseeing that program. I also oversee our prevention program. And I get to share our on the ground lessons learned with people like yourself, with policymakers, to try to take kind of what is happening on the ground and create broader systems change.
Well, firstly, shout out to you for taking on the impossible job and doing it and growing into it and building out a staff that's doing, I think, truly crucial work and work that I don't think we talk enough about. So I'm glad to have you on, and I'm glad that you're doing that work. Trying to think, yeah, were you going to say something?
No, I mean, thank you. I think it is a testimony to, sometimes you do have to take that leap of faith. I had moved to Connecticut. My husband's a doctor. He has a very specialized career opportunity. So we came to Connecticut for his career, and I didn't really know what I was going to do here with expertise in human trafficking. And this was one of the few jobs, actually at that time, I think only job posted related to that. And so I took a leap of faith, right? I knew the job was kind of written in an almost impossible way, right? You can't serve a single person can't serve an entire state. And it was a lot of hard work, but I think what it has grown and built into is truly amazing. And we are really able to provide really specialized services. I think a lot of times people aren't aware of human trafficking and of, unlike other forms of sexual abuse or child sexual abuse, human trafficking also involves the commodification of your body. And so the trauma that goes along with that and the way in which that needs to be addressed is significantly different, right? We're talking about children whose physical bodies have been sold. They now know for the rest of their life, if I'm ever in a difficult financial situation, I now know that that is an option through which I can get money, right? So when we're talking about older youth transitioning to adulthood, right, and we're thinking of how do we prepare them for their first job, for their career, right, conversations about minimum wage are different for this population, right? When they go and they are creating their first resume, questions like what have you done in the past to make money, or what are your skill sets, hit differently for this population. And so, I think it's really important for us to recognize that human trafficking is it's a really horrific crime. It does not define who these kids are or what their potential in life is, but it does require really specialized services, and we need to ensure that more people out there are trained to work with this population, because I think this is a population that is really hidden under the radar, and a lot of times, public health people are coming in touch with this population and they're not even realizing it, right? They're characterizing it as a rape or a sexual assault or family violence, and not seeing the commodification part that often goes hidden.
What are some of the most common misconceptions about human trafficking that you frequently encounter, and how do we address them?
Sure. Yeah. The most common misconception is kind of the Hollywood misconception, right? It's the that kids are kidnapped, that they're held against their will, that there's physical force. And what we find is that, that is a very small percentage of the kids that we work with. The large majority of kids that we work with are groomed, they're recruited. It's a longer process. Some are trafficked by family members. Some are trafficked for drugs, for rent, for support, financial support, because the family doesn't have significant financial resources. Some are recruited because and trafficked because they're involved in child welfare or juvenile justice, and they're looking for maybe families that they don't have and love and attention and support. And but we've also seen kids trafficked who come from well resourced homes with two parents, and it would surprise you. The reality is traffickers are going to try to find a vulnerability, right? Whatever your child's vulnerability is, and then they're going to exploit that. And with the, kind of now not even introduction, but the just common way in which kids have access to the internet. It used to be that when we would talk about trafficking years ago, we would talk about physically meeting somebody at a mall or at a park, and now traffickers can really reach our children anywhere. And we've seen a lot of trafficking and a lot of the grooming and recruitment process actually happen in children's bedrooms, with their parents being completely unaware. So, I think there's a misconception that this only happens for system involved children, or only happens for kids in low income communities or families. And the reality is that while system involvement and socioeconomic status are huge vulnerabilities, right, that traffickers take advantage of, they're not the only vulnerabilities. And we are seeing more and more children being groomed and recruited online.
What are some of those other vulnerabilities that you see?
Sure. I think that one of the big things, especially for our females, but also for our males, is that they're really looking for kind of, who am I? Where do I belong? Right? We work with a lot of adolescents, and adolescence is an age in which you're trying to figure out, who are you? What is your group? Do you belong? You feel different, right? Every kid, I remember as an adolescent, I felt different. I thought I was, more mature than my friends. My friends couldn't understand me, but I now as an adult, I look back and realize that that's a very common experience that many adolescents have. We all feel like we don't fully fit in. And so traffickers, again, will take advantage of that vulnerability. Will say, you're different than other kids your age, right? You're different than other people I've met. There's something special about you. We have this bond. I've never had this with anybody else. Think about the life we could create, right? And so they really are feeding in to everything that adolescents are seeking, right? Which is belonging, which is love, which is a sense of validation, and having someone see them for who they feel they really are. And that is what traffickers kind of reinforce. And certainly, if there's other vulnerabilities, again, like I said, socioeconomic, or we've had even kids who have had disabilities, that is a vulnerability. Traffickers will leverage those vulnerabilities as well. But a lot of it is relational, right? And that's also kind of where, that false narrative that kids are held and that they can't escape, right? A lot of times afterwards we'll hear, once a kid is kind of identified, well, why didn't they just leave? Or why didn't they just stop? Why did they go back? And the reality is that traffickers spend a lot of time creating that emotional bond with their victims. So, and then they'll give them this false sense sometimes that they could leave, that this is their choice. And that's part of the victimization, right? If you want to go, go, but know that no one's going to look at you the same way. No one's going to think about you the same way. What would your parents say if they knew what you'd been doing here, right? And so there's a lot of mental manipulation that goes into this form of victimization. And a lot of our work on the back end with these youth is really helping them to understand that kind of all the messaging that the traffickers have given them is part of an effort to keep them tied to them, right? That was part of the victimization. That was part of leveraging their power to get these youth to do what they wanted them to do so that they could profit off of their bodies.
Appreciate you going into that, and this is having me think about so many things. And I guess the first thing that's kind of come into my mind is just like when I was in school, I always, I don't know, I feel like they were in groups and out groups, and I was someone that would just transition between groups. And when people kind of like picked on someone, I would just kind of like be with that person and stuff like that. And I think about like how important it is when you don't feel like you belong somewhere. How important it is to just have a friend or someone who cares for you, so that maybe you yeah, I don't know. Let me know if, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember working with youth who, one youth, she was one of the only Black youth that went to her high school, right? She really did not feel like she fit in. And the individuals who trafficked her offered a community of, other Black girls that looked like her, right? And she knew that part of leaving that situation, which she didn't like, this wasn't something, but she would also lose her only Black friends, right? She would lose a place where she felt like these were other girls that saw her for who she was. These were other girls who could understand and appreciate her family dynamics and things like that her friends at school couldn't understand because they were all white. And so, sometimes I have another youth, we've worked with kids who, and these are now adults, but who after 9/11, right, were felt very ostracized because of their families, and they were Middle Eastern, and so they were vulnerable because while they didn't feel like they fit into their community, or they felt their community was shunning them because of their Middle Eastern heritage, other people took them in and promised them security and love. And you also see that with the LGBTQ community. You also see that with and again, these are vulnerabilities that traffickers are very well aware of, and they're going to leverage these vulnerabilities, right? They're going to leverage, this is the place you belong. You thought you belonged back in school with those other people, but look around. This is where you belong. And if you hear that enough, and you hear that reinforced by other individuals over and over again, you start thinking, maybe this is where I belong, right? I have, and especially after you start being exploited, right? Then you feel even more pulled away from kind of the square kids at school, right? How am I going to go back to that environment? None of those kids are going to understand what I've been through. They're going to look at me differently because I feel different now that this has happened to me. And so again, it's this perpetuating narrative where you're told you're different, you're told you're special, but then you're also told you don't no longer belong where you were. And you can't really go back and just have everything go back to normal. And there's some truth in that, right? There is truth. Once you've experienced this level of trauma, you can't just flip a switch and go back to how it was. There is real trauma that you have to deal with and work through. But that also reinforces the trafficker's narrative of you no longer belonging in that world.
And you kind of shared or spoke to this, but technology is rapidly evolving. How is it both shaped like the risk and the prevention strategies in child trafficking?
Yeah, technology is rapidly evolving, and I will say, at a policy level, at a macro level, we have put way too much onus on parents, right? We have the message of, well, parents have the ability to turn on parent controls, or parents can regulate their kids' screen time. Like, I mean, literally, these companies are hiring psychologists to get our kids addicted to the apps, right? They are how is a parent supposed to go up against an entire industry that has hired psychologists to create addictive apps and games, right? It's impossible. And so, unfortunately, there does need to be more regulation around this. There does need to be more protections. For a long time, kids would go in and all of their settings would be public, right? Everything was public because that was the way in which the companies could make the most money, right? Now we're starting to see companies really only because of pressure and fear of regulation start to make default settings for kids different, right? More private, but it's still not enough, right? We are seeing, and I will say this, I'm a parent of two, right? My kids game. My oldest has a phone. My kids go on sleepovers. I think there is a real sense of, oh my gosh, we can't give them anything, right? And we don't want to go in that direction either, right? We don't want our kids to feel like the world is not safe in general. The world is a scary place. Everybody is out to get you, right? That's not a healthy status quo either. That will cause a lot of anxiety in our kids. I think it's really about having a lot of conversations about this, right? You can go into your schools, you can ask them what they're doing with internet safety, you can ask them what resources they're giving your kids. But I will tell you, as someone who goes into my own school, I sit on the school board for my school. Schools have a really hard job and they have a lot of things they're supposed to address with our kids, and they're not keeping up, right? It's almost impossible because, like you said, the internet changes so much. When we had actually, if you go on our website, which is love146.org, on the top of the homepage, you can sign up to receive an email series for parents and caregivers, really focused on how do you go about introducing technology, right? What happens if you've over introduced? And we use this analogy that it's like teaching a child to cross a street, right? You wouldn't take them to New York City at age 5 and, drop their hand and say, I'm going to be back in like an hour or two. And, just like, good luck, don't talk to anyone that you don't know, and like walk away. But that's virtually what we do when we hand these kids tablets with, no instruction, no guidance, no parental or safety features on them. And so, we really talk about the value of, when you're crossing the street for the first time, you hold a kid's hand, you look both ways, you walk them through the steps. As they get older, eventually you're going to drop that hand. You're going to start with streets without a lot of traffic, and then you're going to start with streets with more traffic, crossing at the intersection. The goal is by the age of 18, that kid can navigate New York City, right? That's the goal. You want them. And the same is true for technology, right? We need to think about kind of how do we introduce technology in a more buffered manner, right? Where they can only access the apps that we have looked at and seen and reviewed and we think are okay. Where as they get older and we give them more freedom, we have conversations. I had a long conversation with my son before he got his phone, and mind you, that's still a monitored phone. We still we have to approve apps. He has limited time on it, but we had a long conversation that you will come across things that are scary, that are inappropriate. And no, you can never unsee something. So if you're sitting there looking and you're wondering, should I keep looking or should I swipe? Like just swipe, just look, move on, because you can't unsee it. We had to have a long conversation about, what does pornography look like on the internet, and the realities, or the fact that a lot of it is not real, right? Because again, if you don't proactively have those conversations, then kids assume what they see and read on the internet is true, right? And that's and if you don't have the conversation, my kids started gaming in 3rd grade, right? We were in the pandemic. It was one of the only ways for my 3rd grader to have, conversations and socialize with his friends at that time. But we had long conversations about, who do you game with? Who do you talk to on your headset? What happens if somebody that you don't know asks to enter your pod? What happens if your friend vouches for that person? Who might that person be, right? We walked him through, what does it look like to say to your friends, dude, I don't know him, I'm not gonna game. And what happens if somebody starts talking to you and starts engaging with you and you don't really know them, right? We can allow our kids to have these experiences The other thing I think that's really important for us to do, especially as kids become adolescents, is to talk to them about the reality of that age, right? So one of the things we said to our son was, look, we're going to have rules in this house. You will know the rules. And part of being an adolescent is that you're going to push back against those rules. And you might even break some. You probably will break some. And what I want you to know is that when you break those rules, the most important thing to me is your safety, right? We'll deal with the rule breaking later. But the most important thing to me in that moment is your safety. And that's a really important proactive message to send to kids, because we've had so many kids who have said, yeah, I thought about saying it, but I knew that my mom had told me I shouldn't go to that party. I had already been grounded and I snuck out of the house, right? I was told to not talk to people I didn't know online, or not to send pictures, right? They're so worried about breaking that rule that is what they're worried about, not actually the fact that they're being harmed.
I love that. I love that. And I think this is the conversation that we need to be having now, is like, I don't have children as yet, and as well as, like, I'm going to share this with my girlfriend. But I think,
Yeah.
like, this is very, very important, because I think, like, technology use, as well as, like, having mature conversations with children about things that can literally affect them in many ways, is so essential to the world that we live in right now. And I think it is a disservice to not do that and to be proactive in it. And it's a conversation I've had with many sexual health educators. Like, consent is about giving you my pen, and if you want it, and just having those conversations on a level that makes sense, as well as keeps them safe. And I love the point of, despite anything going wrong, like, I just want you to be safe, because I know I've tested I've tested things, and you're really grateful that maybe it didn't end up the worst way it could have, and maybe not knowing that you didn't have that parent that you could have confided in or gotten that support with is hard. So I'm glad that you were able to build that bridge as well.
And I think one of the things for us adults in the field, and just even parents or adults that don't have kids to know generally, is like, home is not safe for all kids,
Hmm.
right? Like you said, not all kids do have parents that they can go into. So saying it to your nieces, your nephew, the kids down the street, right? I remember, I've said even to my kids' friends as they've come over, you guys are really awesome. You're really special. We love when you guys come to our house. If you guys ever need anything, I just want you to know you guys can always come to us. We're here, right? We're not saying don't go to your parents. We're not saying we're here. But for the kid that doesn't feel like they can go to their parents, they will pocket away the fact that you have opened that door to them, right? And they may not use it, but they might. And just the fact that they know that someone cared enough about them to open that door to them is so impactful for those kids who don't feel like they have any adults they can go to in their life.
Thank you for raising that as well. I will link to the Love 146 website below, so that parents and other folks can download that and kind of learn more. I think is very important. You've worked both on state and national policy committees. What progress have you seen in the US on combating child trafficking, and what gaps remain?
Sure. Overall, we've made a lot of progress trying to go after the traffickers, right? There's a lot of laws that really, criminalize trafficking, give fairly harsh punishments. Every state has state laws. There's also the national laws. Um, and I think we've trained up law enforcement and prosecutors. Certainly, there's always more to do, but I think there has been a pretty significant focus there. I think where we have focused less, unfortunately, is on the prevention side and is on the victim services side, right? We've really focused on going after the bad guys, right? But not making sure that those who are vulnerable are protected and have the information they need to make the best decisions to protect themselves, right? And so, we still don't have enough funding for services, and the funding that exists is very scattered and not always consistent. We don't, in my opinion, no kid should graduate middle school without knowing the basics of trafficking, right? By the time we hit high school, a lot of our kids say, it's too late. I'm already doing things online I shouldn't be doing, right? I already have people that I connect to online that I probably in hindsight shouldn't have, or in my life, or I didn't know how to get out of an unhealthy relationship, right? I didn't know what were warning flags, right? So our youth have really told us that middle school is the age at which they need this information, right? Elementary school, we can talk about like kind of what is your space, what are your boundaries, what is safe touch, unsafe touch, right? We can talk about those type of things in an age appropriate manner more broadly, but when we actually are talking about trafficking specific, really middle school is the time that their mind has developed enough to really understand that commodification aspect, that payment for sexual act. And it's early enough that we can kind of get them before most of them will experience that dangerous situation. As you said, I can't think of a single adult that can't look back on their adolescence and think, God, I found myself in some pretty tight situations. And, but for the grace of God, I am here and I am safe, and nothing bad or worse happened to me, right? Not everyone got out unscathed, but some people got out, but, and things could have been worse, right, for them. And the reality is we forget about that, and we think like, oh, these teenagers won't experience what I did. They're all going to find themselves in difficult situations. They're all going to find themselves. And if we haven't proactively talked to them about what they can do, where, who they can call, that they have a right to say no, that if anything happens to them, they have a right to share that it's not their fault, things like that, then we're really throwing them out there in New York City without any guidance or any life jacket. And so, then kids will make up in their mind or hear from their peers, oh, you can't do that, or you can't say that, your parents are going to be so mad, X, Y, and Z, right? I mean, I remember talking to one person, and she had experienced a horrible sexual assault, and she said, she immediately went to where a lot of, I think, victim blaming goes, and a lot of victim blaming also happens within the victim of, I shouldn't have gone there, I shouldn't have done that, I shouldn't have worn that. And we have to really move away from that, right? I said to her, I don't care if you ran down the street naked. Whoever sexually assault you, it was their fault. You are not at fault for your victimization. But I think as a society, we really have to shift the narrative and put resources towards the victims, and not just resources towards, going after the bad guys. I'm not saying we don't need to do that, but we have focused on that for a while, and now we need to shift our focus.
Appreciate you illuminating that. And I'm thinking about like a similar line of thought. I recently read a book called When Crack Was King, and it kind of talks about the same thing. Like, we're going hard on the drug people and all the people that are selling drugs and stuff like that, but not providing any prevention services. And what happened in the end is that the people became addicted and they had all these issues, and because they were killing off the drug leaders, there were more violence for more to for, and it just exploded on both sides of things. And there still isn't a prevention system broadly in the US for substance users. And it's sadly the same thing here. I hope that one thing that does come from this, someone listening or someone who's actively working on it, works to build out some sort of mandatory curriculum for everyone in middle school, to really understand and learn about something that I think can be prevented if we are able to just be educated and have those conversations.
Yeah, and if you're interested, we have a curriculum. It's been implemented in a lot of schools, in a lot of after school programs. It's called Not a Number. If you go again on our website, which is love146.org, there's a tab. You can click on the Not a Number tab and learn more. We really do start with kind of the basics of what is a healthy relationship?
Mm.
How do you identify what your boundaries are? How do your boundaries change if we're talking about family members, coaches, friends, romantic partners? What can you do if somebody, how will you know, and what can you do if somebody starts encroaching on your boundaries, right? It's really a lot about skill building. We've been telling kids that drugs are bad for, decades, to your point. That is not effective, right?
No.
Kids know drugs are bad. They still do drugs, right? So we need to really talk about skill building, right? What are the coping skills that you can deal with if you do have histories of trauma? What are the skills you can start to build so that if someone does start encroaching on your boundaries, you can kind of deflect that. You can say, "Hey, that's a boundary of mine." Right. But in a manner that makes sense for you, because each person's going to do that differently. And so they have to figure out, what am I comfortable with and how do I practice that? I think, again, we forget, kids come to school, and even all the way through middle school, not everyone knows what a healthy relationship looks like. And even kids who come from families with healthy relationships, it's not like their parents or their family members are saying, "We have a healthy relationship and this is why." So they know what to look for that might lead to an unhealthy relationship, right? We need to actually be actively, proactively having these conversations, which unfortunately I think we aren't doing. A lot of parents don't, they're just trying to survive, taking care of kids and getting them to and from the swimming and the dance classes and stuff. So having a curriculum like this in school, having kids teach other kids and talk with other kids, and creating a new norm within a community is really, really important and very powerful.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I wanted to lift up from what you shared and creating a new norm is around. I feel like a lot of times men would say things like, as you're saying, like, "Oh, she was wearing this," or like, and it mightn't escalate to any high level, but I think that's the mentality that gets to that part. And I hate I will call out my friends, and I will call out people on doing that, and I think we have to continue to do that to create a norm where, because someone is dressed a certain way or looking a certain way, they don't deserve anything. They are human and they have their humanity, and we have to respect that.
Yeah, and the other thing with boys and men is that they're also victims,
Mm.
right? And I don't think we talk enough and have normalized enough that, sexual abuse, sexual assault, trafficking happens to boys and men, right? And we tie it, if it's done at the hands of a female, that you oftentimes hear comments like, "Well, they probably liked it." Well,
Mhm.
good for them, right? She's a cougar. We're normalizing an abuse,
Mhm.
right? That is not the experience of our kids. They are feeling violated and victimized, but we're brushing it off, and we're saying, "Oh, that was cool. You must have liked it," right? And if they're sexually abused by another male, then there's all sorts of assumptions about their sexual orientation, or are they gay, are they, and we try to, and if they are, then it's like, "Oh, well, that must be the reason why." And if they're not, it's like, "Are you sure?" Right? So we don't do that with women, right? We don't associate a sexual attack to sexual orientation, or to, any kind of, you must have liked it type of thing that we do for boys. And I think that a lot of this is a way in which we try to protect ourselves, right? We try to, like, it's so horrific, but unfortunately, the reality is, it really keeps a lot of men and boys from disclosing, right? It really keeps a lot of them from sharing what has happened to them, because in addition to, whatever feelings they have of shame or embarrassment or whatever, they also have this fear of, how am I going to be perceived by
Mhm.
others? How is this, if I go and tell law enforcement, or my friends in my community or my family, How are they going? This is a weakness, right? And again, we mislabel what is actually a sexual victimization. That's not a personal weakness. And so the messages for both men and women are harmful right now. They do look different, but they're both harmful.
I think I could go on for a longer time, but we have to shift gears here. I would love to learn how you got to becoming Chief Programs and Strategy Officer. But before we get into that in your academic pathway, what does public health mean to you?
I think a public health and just public health in general really means, and for me in particular, taking the granular experiences of individuals and looking out to what does that mean as a society, right? What does that mean that what is happening on a systems level, that is showing up in this single child, right? Is showing up in this family, right? Because again, a lot of times what we see in terms of the vulnerabilities, this it's not a self-imposed
Hmm.
vulnerability, right? They come from outside. And so when we're thinking of how do we address trafficking, um, you know, I don't know that we're going to solve the issues of poverty or other vulnerabilities that make people, system involvement, all of that. But I do think that we can't just say, oh, we're not going to solve poverty, so we're not going to make progress, right? And I think that there is a way, and we've seen ways in which our society and our community, especially for children, are really able to rally around the idea that each children should have the best shot at life as possible, right? No child should grow up hungry. No child should grow up without educational, access, right? There are things, and so some of those systems need to be improved for sure, but at least as a society, there's a collective agreement, and we have come together around the conceptual framework of those things. And so how do we come from a place of agreement and where we all agree and move things forward, right? There's a lot of places people disagree, right? And I think we focus on those areas where we disagree, but I really do firmly believe that most people believe, you know kids do better when they are well resourced, especially in terms of basic needs. Education is a key pathway towards a successful future. Most kids do better when they're raised in a home, and a loving home at that, right? That's also well resourced. Like, these are concepts that as a society we can get behind, and let's start from there and figure out how to move forward.
Yeah. How do we get to all children who have smartphones should have education on how to use smartphones and social media as the norm in society?
Exactly. And we have seen that more recently. There's been a lot of schools that have banned
Hmm.
cell phones,
Hmm.
right? That has been like, there's been this wave as society, kids no longer really are having access to cell phones while they're in school because we've seen how detrimental it can be. So there are these waves that we can get behind that can really help improve things for our kids. We just need to figure out kind of where are those points of agreement, how do we create the wave, and how do we push it forward collectively.
So you got your bachelor's degree in social work at Skidmore College. Walk us through the thought process of going into undergrad.
Yeah, so I always kind of knew I wanted to be a helper, in a helping profession. Both of my parents came from the helping profession. They came more from the educational profession. But I kind of always I was raised with the concept of volunteering. I was raised with the concept of helping, and of that being a really worthy career path, right? And I was also raised with the idea that the purpose of life was not just about making money, right? That was a pretty shallow way to go through life. Was to simply focus um, on the attainment and consumption of things. And so, I walked in. I actually first thought I was going to get a psychology degree. And I went in and spoke with my advisor in psychology, and I started explaining what I was interested in. And he said, "That is not psychology, that is social work." And I was fortunate enough that we had a social work program, because not every school does. and really found my home there, right? Really found other people that cared about what was happening in the world, that wanted to focus on helping people, that were interested um, in looking both at the individual and at the systems level. Like I said, I went abroad. I studied abroad in Kenya when I was in undergrad, and that's where I kind of first came into this idea that kids lived on the street. There were street children at very young ages by themselves. And for my last month there, I worked with those kids and heard the stories, and particularly heard the stories of girls who would say that, the way for them to stay the safest at that time was to either be a group of girls with an older male who basically trafficked them, or to be kind of a wife to a group of boys. And again, they would forage for food and engage in sexual acts with the boys. And from that, I came back and really shifted towards what is this concept that, kids have to engage in sexual acts in order to get their basic needs met. I did work after I graduated in Mexico. I also worked with street children there. And again, I think like many, many people, I thought this was something that only happened over there, right? In those other countries. And came back, started looking at child sex tourism, got a master's in public administration with a focus on international development, thinking that I was going to work abroad on child sex tourism. And then when I graduated, went back, and I just needed one more year for my master's in social work. So I kind of was like, all right, I'll tag on one more year. And then I started working for a place called Polaris. And they did work with people who are trafficked here in the United States. And it really opened my eyes that this is not just something that happens abroad over there, quote unquote, but this is something that's happening here. And it's happening. Part of the reason that it is happening here at such a wide level is because we're all assuming this could never happen here, that this could only happen in another country. And we really need to change our perception of ourselves, our perception of other people, and really look inward and see what is happening to our own children that we're allowing for this to happen. And so really, then I went and I was very focused on, at that time Polaris was filled with a lot of 20-year-olds, really well-intended 20-year-olds, but still we were in our 20s and we were kind of making it up as we went in those first couple of years. And then I kind of became interested in looking at how do we know that what we're doing is having impact, right? And, maybe at best we're having positive impact. Then, there's neutral impact. But what if we're actually, especially at that time, when you look at the demographics of who is being trafficked, is a disproportionate number of BIPOC individuals, right? Black and brown people are for sure more at higher risk, and they're trafficked at a much higher rate. And a lot of the movement, especially in the early days, was white, right? And so, it also kind of made me pause and say, we're seeing these women come in and out of our shelter, and a lot of times they're going back to their traffickers and they're sharing this. How do we know we're having good impact? So I went and I did research and evaluation on federally funded victim services programs to kind of learn, what does that look like? What does that entail? So that when I started the program here in Connecticut for survivor care, one of the first things that I said during my interview was, I want to build a program that can be evaluated, right? I'm very into collecting data. I'm very into making sure that we're actually having impact, right? And so, right now our prevention education program is going through a randomized control trial. That's like the highest level for those who are not familiar of research. And that's happening in Minnesota, and the University of New Hampshire Crimes Against Children Research Center is doing that. And our survivor care program is also going through a longitudinal evaluation with the same center at UNH. And so, that has kind of been my passion as a field. The anti-trafficking field, I think, really needs to move more towards becoming evidence-based and really evaluating what we're doing. It's not that I think we're not having good impact, but I think we need to know what's working the best, and what maybe isn't as impactful, and we need to really put resources towards things that we know are having impact. I think the people we're working with deserve it. This is a matter of making sure that resources, there are limited resources, not just in trafficking, but in all sorts of types of services. And, the more we can get those resources to the things that we know are impactful, the better we are. And unfortunately, that's hard to do with a population where there's a lot of ethical, considerations, right? You can't just do a randomized control trial with victims, right? You get services, but you don't. Sorry, right? Like that doesn't work, right? So we have to be able to do as rigorous of evaluations with these populations as possible, but that only starts if we have programs that are committed to collecting data, to working with external evaluators, and to really working to improve and create the best programs.
Absolutely. And you shared a lot there. And some of the things that I think are useful is like you went on when you were in undergrad, you went on this study abroad trip, was it?
Yes,
To
yeah.
Kenya, and that really like shifted and helped you to think more deeper, and that literally turned into the work that you are doing now, which I think is amazing and a testament to, like, do experiences, you never know what impact that will have and how that will transform you into doing the work that you do or have an experience throughout your life. So I appreciate you sharing all of those things.
Thank you. No, absolutely. And, early on in my career, trafficking was not a thing, right? I remember my uncle saying to me, you shouldn't go down this thing. This won't be a thing in 5 years, right? You're not going to have a career if you. And now I have people who say, how do I get into the anti-trafficking field,
Mm.
right? And my response is like, I don't actually really know, because it wasn't a field when I started. It was like, a bunch of people that were trying to do good in the world, but there weren't conferences about it. There weren't convenings. So, the other thing is like, follow your gut and what feels good and what interests you. And, as long as you can narrate that, your career will be fine. As long as you can explain to anybody interviewing you for any future job why you did this, why you made that pivot. I changed jobs every couple of years when I was younger, right? And I never, ever had a problem getting another job, right? So I think take those risks, especially when you're young, especially when you're trying to figure this out. You have more flexibility. Figure out what you love, what you're passionate about, and set yourself up for a really wonderful career where you really don't just kind of get the economics of having a job. You also get fulfilled through that career.
Absolutely. And what do you see as an opportunity for advancing anti-trafficking work?
Gosh, we're in such a pivotal moment where things are changing so rapidly, both at the federal level and at, with victim services. I do think so, and this is a little bit geeking out, but within the anti-trafficking movement, there's kind of been this fault line around sex work, right?
Mm.
And should it be fully decriminalized, meaning both the selling of sex and the purchasing of sex they're not necessarily legalized and regulated, but they're not criminalized? Or should we decriminalize the selling of sex because we're going to implicitly assume those individuals are being victims or are not making a choice with all of their they're engaging in this because of some sort of vulnerability, but we're still going to criminalize the purchasing of sex? Or do we maintain what we have now, which is that both selling and purchasing are illegal? I will say this is for adults, not kids, right? So the argument, everyone agrees that kids should not be. There's no such thing as a child prostitute, and that buyers should not be able to buy children for sex, right? So this is adults, but the implication on child trafficking is something that's hotly debated.
Mm.
And while I think that this is an important question, and I think it's much more complicated than you might initially think once you kind of start going into the weeds of everybody's argument, it has really sucked a lot of the air out of talking about other things where there is a lot more agreement and commonality. So things like, how do we get people into housing, right? When people come out of a traffic situation, what is the best way to get them into stable housing so that they are not vulnerable for re-victimization, right? How do we get them into appropriate trauma-based therapy? What do we do in terms of career advancement and making sure that they can become economically independent? So again, we reduce vulnerability to re-victimization. There's a lot of agreement and a lot of passion around those areas, but unfortunately, we use a lot of our political capital on this one issue where there is an agreement, and I think that's really short-sighted. And I am starting to see a willingness in the movement to look beyond where we disagree on that issue to come together and work collectively in the areas where there is agreement. And so that makes me hopeful.
And if someone listening to this wanted to make a tangible impact on preventing trafficking in their own community, where should they start?
Gosh, first for sure, sign up for that email that I mentioned that's on our website, which is love146.org. I do think it gives some really tangible things that you can say when you're having these discussions with kids. The other thing I would say is talk to kids in your life, right? Everyone has nieces and nephews or grandkids or friends, there are, even if you don't have your own kids, you have kids, right? You have kids in your life that are important to you. You have kids in your community that are important in general. So start having conversations. An easy in is to say, I was listening to this podcast the other day and they started talking about this thing called trafficking. Have you heard about it? Has anybody ever talked to you about it? What are your thoughts on it? They were talking about internet safety. Like, what apps are you on, right? Just citing that you are listening to this is a great in to a great conversation, because this is not a one and done type of thing. These are ongoing conversations that we need to be having. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't also say that, if you are someone that works with kids in the school system or in an after school program or in juvenile justice or any kind of place where kids congregate and you're interested in our Not a Number curriculum, please go on our website and reach out to us. We do trainings, across the country, and would love to kind of continue to expand that work.
And then a past week's guest asked a question, and the question they ask is, what one word or phrase would best describe your journey?
Hopeful. I think that it's not that my journey has been linear or easy, right? There were a lot of times where I worried about failure, or I did fail, right? I just flat out failed, or I said the complete wrong thing publicly and embarrassed. Like, I've made so many mistakes. I remember early on in my career at Love 146 calling my boss and saying, you are going to get a phone call from a school that is very mad at me, and they are going to tell you that you need to fire me. And I just want you to know that, like, this is why I did what I did. And this is, I have had all of that. And I think what has kept me going has always been the hope. Like, you see these kids and they're laughing and they're funny and they're wonderful. And I want them to know, and I am hopeful that they can live beyond this experience. Yes, it was a horrible experience. It was a traumatic experience, but I want them to get 2, 5, 10 years out and say, that was horrible what happened to me, but it doesn't define me, and it didn't define me. And who I am and what I am becoming in life is so much more than that experience. And so I'm hopeful for the future, because I think that, with the right time, with the right amount of time and the right amount of resources and support, really anything is possible.
And now shifting you to the Furious Five, the 5 questions I ask all guests. Number 1, what advice would you give to a student trying to pursue a career in public health or social work?
And I mentioned it before, but I think what I would say is, you're going to have a lot of people who ask you questions, a lot of people who doubt you, who talk to you about how you're not going to make as much money as if you chose another career. And I think, you know, some of those things are true, but if this is your passion and this is what you want to do, I can tell you, you will be so much happier in life. I have friends that went down that path of choosing money over passion, and they are not happy. They are in their 40s, they are looking back and they are saying, I made the wrong choice. I should have chosen differently. And so, you're young, you're figuring it out, but know that you can make a decent living in these fields, right? You can both do good work. You are not going to be a billionaire. That is true. But I think you're going to gain so much more, and you're going to look back and know that what you did with your life really did make a difference for people.
Number two, if you're talking to someone wanting to get into your position, what advice would you give them?
The path is not linear, right? Like, get the skills, focus on the skills even over the title, right? When I took this position at Love 146, I actually ended up taking both a title cut and a pay cut, which I would not necessarily recommend, but that was my way in to being able to build something, right? Once I got in, I was able to build what I wanted to. And I was able to do that because I came into the position with really significant skill sets that I had gained by doing some of the career jumping that I did early on, by understanding how do you collect data, what data is important. Also, how do you work with individuals in therapy? How do you work best with kids? And so, as you kind of think about building your career or your resume, don't just focus on the titles. Also think about what skills are you gathering, and really be able to articulate those skills.
Number three, what's something you're working on improving in your life right now?
Oh, so I just took a 6-week sabbatical, which was amazing. And I read an amazing book called Too Much, which I would highly, highly recommend. And one of the things that it really taught me was that I need to be clearer in my own boundaries, right? In my own, I am a helper by nature. I am someone that says yes. I lean in, and that is what leads eventually to burnout, right? And so, the only person who can shift that is me, right? I can't. Other people are able to ask, right? But I have to be okay saying no, or saying I need a minute to think about it, and really thinking, is this something I want to do? Is this how I want to spend my time? And then on the flip side of that, I need to become better when other people say no, and when other people set their boundaries, right? Those of us who are yes people are sometimes shocked when other people say no to something that we would have said yes to. And so it's both, learning to set my boundaries and be better, and also respecting when other people, and really respecting it, not just giving voice to it, but really honoring and respecting when other people set their own boundaries as well.
Number four, professionally, do you recommend anything outside of Too Much?
So professionally, one of the things that has been really, really helpful for me is having both a micro and a macro perspective. And by that, I mean, I think people tend to say, oh, well, I only work with individuals. I work at the micro level, right? Or I only work at the systems level with policy change. And I think that's okay. You don't have to work at both levels, but I do think there's a strong benefit to understanding both levels, right? Otherwise, you can be working at the micro level with individuals and see things that should be changed at the policy level, even internally within your organization, but not really understand how to go about that, right? You can see legislation that should be changed, but you have no idea how to impact that. And the reality is that legislators want to hear from the people on the ground about what needs to happen. And so if you understand and become comfortable reaching out to legislators or people that make policy, you actually can have a significant impact, even if it's not the primary of your job. And at the same time, I think as systems people, we need to recognize that we don't always recognize the unintended outcomes of some of the policies we pass, right? It's a good intent, right? We think we're making good impact, but we've never actually asked the people on the ground, how would something like this impact you? Are there things that we're not thinking of? And we're so quick to play the chess game of how do we pass the legislation that we don't think of the real on the ground world impact of some of the things that we're compromising on or we're willing to put into bills and things. So I would suggest that, wherever you're working in the field, macro or micro, do try to stay connected to people that are working in the other areas and try to educate yourself and become, even if it's just like dipping a toe in that ocean of work, try to be a little connected so that you don't, you're not really so disconnected. We need both people at the micro and macro, but we also really need them to be more connected than they currently are.
And number 5, last but not least, if there was one piece of advice you'd give to your younger self, what would that be?
I think that, so I thought I was going to work internationally, right? And so I kind of had always assumed I was going to have these adventures through my work experience. And then I didn't realize that once you have kids, you can't just like go on adventures. It's much harder. It's not that you can't, it's just much harder and it's way more expensive, right? So while you're young, you're going to get a lot of people that are like, no, you should settle down, you should start saving. And all of those things are probably, to a certain extent true. But also, this is a period of your life where you can just have adventures. And those, to your point, those adventures might change who you are, or how you think about your career, the pathway that you're on. But no matter, even if they don't, they are amazing, wonderful memories. And they are always, they show you what you're able to achieve and accomplish. And so while you are young, set out a side of time and a side of money for adventures and just do it, right? Just go, just do it. You will never, ever regret taking those adventures.
Erin, this has been a phenomenal conversation. I've learned so much from you and really enjoyed the conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great to speak to you as well.